Again, good evening. Thank you, Tony, for leading us in those songs. Really loved that last one, too, so I didn't mind the switch one bit. So, if you guys have a Bible with you tonight, go ahead and be turning to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. We'll be continuing in our series tonight, History Worth Repeating. And if you've noticed, we're getting pretty close to the end of Chronicles here. So there are only a couple weeks left in our series, about 3 weeks left. And Stephen and I, when we were splitting up the dates, he gave me this week and he gave me next week. And he said, all right, there are 3 different topics that you can cover and you've only got 2 weeks to do it, so just pick 2 of them, right? But you guys know that I'm not great at picking and choosing things, so I actually am sort of going to be able to talk about all 3 of them in the next 2 weeks. So get ready. It's going to be a lot of fun together. No, we're going to have a great time, I think, looking at chapters 32 and 33, different sections of those of 2 Chronicles together tonight. And we're going to talk about one king that we discussed last week and one king that I think story has to be paired, at least as far as the chronicler is concerned, with that prior king. Of course, tonight we'll be continuing talking about Hezekiah, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the king Manasseh as well. And you wouldn't think it from reading Kings together, and we haven't done a whole lot of comparing between the stories in Kings and the stories in Chronicles, but you wouldn't think from the book of Kings that Hezekiah and Manasseh really have anything that you should do to compare their stories. Hezekiah is thought of as a great king, a good king, a reformer like Stephen talked about last week, one who unified the people, even the people who had lived in the northern kingdom for the Passover time. Whereas Manasseh, well, he's a terrible king. He doesn't follow God. In fact, he's considered in Kings to be even worse than those Canaanite kings that had come before. All the nations that God had driven out, Hezekiah is great, but Manasseh, he's worse than all of those kings even. But the chronicler tonight in 2 Chronicles is going to tell those stories side by side in a way that I think requires us to read them together, to understand why both of these kings have different events in their lives that are worth us as people reading about their stories today repeating. So we'll be starting in 2 Chronicles chapter 32 tonight in verse 1. As I mentioned last week, Stephen talked about Hezekiah and all the good that he did for the kingdom of Judah. He restored worship. He celebrated the Passover. He set the people of Judah and Israel together in unity and asked that God would cover over the mistakes that they made as they tried to come back to Him again and be His people again. And it's after all of those good things, all of those great things that Hezekiah did that we get our story tonight. In fact, the first verse of chapter 32 reminds us of that. It says, after these things and these acts of faithfulness. So it wasn't because Hezekiah did anything wrong. It's actually in spite of the fact that Hezekiah is doing everything right. King Sennacherib of Assyria came and invaded Judah. And he encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and had intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his warriors to stop the flow of the springs that were outside of the city, and they helped him. So Hezekiah sees that there is a battle coming, and he and his commanders, he and his officers are going to begin preparing for that. If you were to read the next few verses there, you would see that they cut off the springs. They try and make it where Sennacherib has no water that he and his army can supply themselves with. He's going to fortify the city. He's going to prepare more weapons and shields so that he and his people are ready to defend Jerusalem against this great army. And we're told that the army of Sennacherib was great. This was a really strong enemy that Israel and Judah would face here with Hezekiah fighting against Sennacherib. And in verse 7, after they've done all those things, we're told that Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to them, saying in verse 7, be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there is one greater with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." And we're told the people were encouraged by the words of King Hezekiah of Judah. So Hezekiah goes into this and he tells the people of Judah, he says, don't be afraid of everything that they have, because the one who is with us is greater. I want us to begin with this premise tonight, and it's what Hezekiah tells the people of Judah. He says, our God is not like other gods. And I want us to think about that. The story as it's told to us, as Hezekiah wanted his own people to understand, is that our God, the God we serve today even, is not like other gods. And I think that's going to come into focus as we see what happens with the rest of our story tonight. Because we're about to read 11 verses together of Assyria trying to say that this God is no different. Trying to convince the kingdom of Judah, your God is no different than any other God. And he will not be able to do anything for you because no other God has been able to do anything to stop us. Let's continue reading together then. In verse 9, it says, after this, while King Sennacherib of Assyria was at Lachish with all of his forces, he sent his servants to Jerusalem, to King Hezekiah of Judah, and to all the people of Judah that were in Jerusalem, saying, thus says Sennacherib, king of Assyria, on what are you relying that you undergo the siege of Jerusalem? He says, why have you stuck around? Why would you submit yourselves to this siege? Is not Hezekiah misleading you and handing you over to die by famine and by thirst? When he tells you, the Lord our God will save us from the hand of the king of Assyria. Was it not this same Hezekiah who took away his high places and his altars and commanded Judah and Jerusalem, saying, before one altar you shall worship, and upon it you shall make your offerings? Do you not know what I and my ancestors have done to the peoples of other lands? Were the gods of the nations of those lands at all able to save their lands out of my hand? Who among all the gods of those nations that my ancestors utterly destroyed was able to save his people from my hand, that your God should be able to save you from my hand? Now therefore do not let Hezekiah deceive you or mislead you in this fashion, and do not believe him. For no God of any nation or kingdom has been able to save his people from my hand or from the hand of my ancestors. How much less will your God save you out of my hand? Sennacherib doesn't necessarily come to knock down the walls. He comes down to knock the people's hearts out of their chest, doesn't he? He says, who does your king Hezekiah think he is? He doesn't have any leg to stand on. And then we see that Sennacherib clearly doesn't understand the God of Israel. He says he tore down all his high places. He got rid of all the altars. He says you only need to worship here. And we, of course, reading the story, know, well, that's what they were supposed to do. But Sennacherib is trying to intimidate the people here. He says, you're going to call upon that God? Beyond that, he says, which God of any of the nations that we've conquered? And we have to know, if you read the Old Testament, at this point in the history of the world, Assyria may well be the strongest power in the world. They have defeated nation after nation. It was Assyria that carried the northern kingdom of Israel, Judah's neighbors, Judah's brethren. Assyria carried them into captivity. And now they've turned south and they say, what God could possibly stop us? Who could stand against us? Don't think that this will go any differently for you than it did any of those nations that we've already conquered. And then I want you to see what they do next even. It's not enough just to disparage their God and try and undermine the Israelites' faith in their God. It says in verse 16 that his servants said still more against the Lord God and against his servant Hezekiah. And he also wrote letters to throw contempt on the Lord, the God of Israel, and to speak against him, saying, just as the gods of the nations in other lands did not rescue their people from my hands, so the God of Hezekiah will not rescue his people from my hand. And they shouted it with a loud voice in the language of Judah to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall to frighten and terrify them, in order that they might take the city. They spoke of the God of Jerusalem as if he were like the gods of the peoples of the earth, which are the work of human hands. And that is, ultimately, that last verse, a summation of what Sennacherib and his messengers try and do here for the people living in Jerusalem. I want you to picture this. Sennacherib sends his messengers into the shouting range of Jerusalem, to the city, and they shout in a loud voice in the language of the people of Judah. They are yelling at them in their own language and saying, your God will not save you. How intimidating do you think that would be? As it's not some people coming and shouting that you don't understand. It's people shouting at you in your own language, your God cannot save you. I imagine Sennacherib has tried this tactic before. It seems like it would be an effective one. We're told that they did this to terrify and to soften the hearts of the people so that they could take the city more easily. But this story tonight, and as the chronicler says, the mistake that Assyria makes is that they do not see what we reading the story know. The God of Judah is not like all of those other gods. And we're about to see why. Because if you continue in the story, it says, Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz, prayed because of this, and they cried to heaven, and the Lord sent an angel who cut off all of the mighty warriors and commanders and officers in the camp of the king of Assyria. And so Sennacherib returned in disgrace to his own land. When he came into the house of his God, some of his own sons struck him down there with the sword. And so the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of King Sennacherib of Assyria and from the hand of all of his enemies. He gave them rest on every side. Many brought gifts to the Lord in Jerusalem and precious things to King Hezekiah of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of all the nations from that time onward. Sennacherib did not know what we know, that the Lord God of Judah, the Lord God of Israel, is not like all of those other gods. And he proves it whenever he goes out. He fights Israel's battle for them, as Hezekiah had said that he would, throws the Assyrian camp into disarray, and Sennacherib has to go back home empty-handed, where he is struck down by his own sons in the house of his God. God flips this story on its head. Everything that Assyria thought would happen when they marched on Jerusalem actually just flips over. It's not Hezekiah who's struck down in his city, maybe even in the house of his own God, but rather Sennacherib here. And we're told that God exalted Hezekiah before all of the nations. Our God is not like all of the other gods of these nations, because he's not made with human hands. Most importantly, because he's able to do things that those gods cannot. And we see that in the story of Hezekiah here, that our God is able to do things that other gods simply could not do. Assyria had defeated many nations. Sennacherib is not wrong to say to Judah, what is your God going to do for you? None of the gods of these other nations have done anything for them. Because that's all that he knows. I was coaching recently, and I was on the sideline of a soccer game, and I looked at a player, and I mentioned to one of the coaches, as that player, instead of jumping up, you're supposed to head the ball when it's up in the air, right? Maybe some of you have been watching the World Cup recently. You've learned that. Maybe not. Who knows? You don't want to wake up at 9 o'clock to watch soccer. But you're supposed to head the ball when it's up high, and I just made a comment off the cuff to one of my coaching assistants there. I said, that player will not head the ball. And he said, are you sure? I said, I'm absolutely sure. I've watched him a million times in practice. He will kick above his head before he will head that ball. And of course, I said, if he heads it, I would be shocked. I would pick up all the gear at the end of practice for the next week if that player actually heads the ball. And so, of course, the coach took me up on it. He said, hey, so-and-so, I need you to head the ball. And wouldn't you know it, the very next play, he did it. But was I wrong to think that he wouldn't? And luckily that coach said, I'm not going to make you pick everything up, Coach. I just want you to know that I can get things done that you can't. So there we go. But was I wrong to think that he wouldn't head the ball? No, because I had watched him over and over again. We had been in that exact situation hundreds of times, and the result had always been the same. We can't blame Sennacherib for looking and saying, none of these gods before have stopped us. The problem in this story is that Sennacherib didn't know that the God of Israel, the God of Judah, was different. He was a God who was able to do things that other gods are not able to do, and that's because he is not a false God made with human hands. He's a God with power. He's a God who defends his people, who fights their battles for them. But he's also a God who's able to do those things even whenever his people fail. Even whenever it seems like the enemy armies have won. And I think that that's why it's important to see the two stories that we're looking at tonight together. Because, yes, Hezekiah is a great king. And it makes sense that God would look after Hezekiah and would look after the kingdom of Judah because Hezekiah is doing everything right. But what will God do? What will this God of Israel, this God of Judah, who is not like other gods, who is able to do things they are not able to do because he's powerful, what will he do with a king who does not follow him, who does not serve him? How will he respond then? You can flip over to chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, we're told. It's not slow getting to the point in this chapter. In verse 2, we're told he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had pulled down, and he erected altars to the Baals, made sacred poles, worshipped all of the host of heaven, and he served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem shall my name be forever. Manasseh built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He made his son pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. That is, he sacrificed his son to a foreign god. He practiced soothsaying and augury and sorcery, and he dealt with the mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking the Lord God to anger. The carved image of the idol that he had made, he set in the house of God, of which God had said to David and to his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will never again remove my feet from Israel, or the feet of Israel from the land that I appointed for your ancestors, if only they will be careful to do all that I have commanded them, all the law and the statutes and the orders given through Moses. Well, we see that they're not doing that. Manasseh misled Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem so that they did more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the people of Israel. This is a dire situation, right? We've had this good king, Hezekiah, who led the people to do what they were supposed to do, who unified them, who led them in worship, back to worship. And now his son Manasseh has completely flipped all of that on its head. He has set up worship to idols, not only across the kingdom, but in the temple itself. He has done abominations before the Lord. Even in the place where God said that he would not pull his people from. Manasseh, we're told, misled the people, led them away from their God. And you guys have been working through this book of Chronicles with us long enough to know what's going to happen, don't you? Whenever an evil king comes to power, what typically happens? Well, God sends justice. He sends His judgment down. And that king is dealt with. So it is with the story of Manasseh. We're told the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they gave no heed in verse 10. Verse 11 says, Therefore the Lord brought against them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria. The same Assyria that was just defeated in the reign of his father Hezekiah. That kingdom, Assyria, comes and they attack Manasseh. And they took him captive, bound him with fetters, and brought him to Babylon. While he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. God leads Manasseh to this place where he allows that great kingdom, Assyria, to come and attack and take Jerusalem. They take Manasseh away and carry him off into Babylon. And I want you to think about what Sennacherib said when he surrounded Jerusalem with his army in the reign of Hezekiah. He said, What is your God going to do for you? I want you to consider, what do you think that the kings of Assyria who capture Manasseh and take Jerusalem, what do you think they are saying now? What could your God do for you, Manasseh? Who are the gods of Judah? And we might look and say, well, that's not fair. God actually allowed this. But how does it look to the outside eye? How does it look to those kings of Assyria who have conquered many nations and defeated them in spite of their gods? We might look at this if we didn't know better tonight and say, you're right. Their gods weren't able to stop the invasion. They delayed it, sure. But the God of Judah was not ultimately able to save his people. I find it interesting that if you were to ask someone what they know about the invasion of Sennacherib, many church-going folks would probably tell you the first thing that stands out at them whenever Hezekiah is king, maybe the most defining part of Hezekiah's rule, is the prayer he gives before Sennacherib invades. The chronicler does not record that prayer at all, beyond the fact to mention that Hezekiah and Isaiah pray. And yet we got 11 verses of Sennacherib's messengers questioning God's validity in defending his people. And I don't think that's by accident. Because the very next chapter, we see a king of Judah dragged from the city of Jerusalem. The Assyrians see a God who is not able to save his people. But tonight, what we know, church, as we read these texts together, is that this God is not the same as all the other gods of these people who worship false idols made with human hands. He has power beyond that, able to do things they cannot do. Maybe the most important part of these kings and the story that I think is trying to be told here tonight is that he's able to do that. He's able to use his power to save his people, even whenever everything is lost. Even whenever the battle has already been lost. God is able to redeem his people. Because as we read, Manasseh did humble himself. In verse 13, we're told he prayed to God, and God received his entreaty. He heard his plea, and he restored him again to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. And then Manasseh knew that the Lord indeed was God. Manasseh goes on to tear down the altars that he had built, to restore worship to God in the temple. We're told that the people still sacrificed at the high places in verse 17, but they only sacrificed to the Lord their God. Manasseh turned it all around. Can you think of a more surprising twist in the Chronicles than the one we're looking at together tonight? This just doesn't happen with the kings of Judah. They're either good and then they start doing bad things, or they're bad and they continue to do bad things. We haven't really seen a lot of stories like this one. where Manasseh is defeated. He's dragged away into captivity. And we're sitting here going, all right, we know how this story goes. And if you're a Jewish person reading this story, coming out of the exile, you go, yeah, we remember how this one went. Manasseh humbled himself. And in spite of the fact that God had allowed him to lose that battle with the Assyrians, in spite of the fact that it appeared for a moment that the Assyrians were more powerful than the God of Israel and Judah, God did not give up on his people. And when Manasseh humbled himself, God restored him to the place that he belonged. Just like Solomon prayed all the way back at the beginning of our series, when your people sin and they turn against you, if they will humble themselves, have mercy on them. Like Stephen talked about a little bit last week. Manasseh humbles himself. And this is a God who has power to do things that other gods cannot do, even whenever we might not expect it. After all, this is the same God who, whenever sin and death and darkness had thought that they had won, when Jesus is laid in that grave and the powers of evil have overtaken the world, this is a God who said, this is not the end. And because of Jesus' humble obedience to God, God raised him up to serve as salvation for all of us, as an example for us. This is the God who took a man who rightly, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, calls himself the chief of sinners, Paul, and flipped his story upside down, even whenever he had done terrible, awful, abominable things to the church. And God was patient when Paul humbled himself. He said, I still have a purpose and a plan for you. Tonight we get these two kings. And we might ask ourselves, okay, yeah, when Hezekiah is faithful, we know what God will do. But what about Manasseh? Well, we see tonight that yes, this God is unlike other gods. And yes, he is powerful, but he is willing to be powerful even whenever the situation seems lost, even whenever all hope is gone. What God is willing to do for Hezekiah whenever he humbles himself, he is able to do even for Manasseh, the worst of these kings, whenever Manasseh humbles himself as well. And he's willing to do that for us tonight. Maybe you find yourself in the shoes of Hezekiah. Maybe you feel like you're following God and you're doing what is right. Maybe you feel like you are in a good place spiritually tonight, but that all of those external, outside forces are kind of surrounding you. All of those naysayers, all of the negativity, all of the temptations and challenges that you've experienced are just surrounding you. Well, we see that God is there. I want you to leave tonight knowing that God is with you. Even as those things that would seek to tear you away from him surround you and close your outlet to him. God is with you. But also, if you find yourself in a place where you say, I am far from him, I am not close to God right now. If you will humble yourself, he is willing. He wants you to be with him. And he will restore you, just like he did Manasseh, to the place that you belong at his side. Whatever the case tonight, however you may receive this message, I pray that all of us, as we leave this place, would tell the world, as we've mentioned, many people are thinking about our God, about Jesus, that may not normally be thinking about him. I pray that we would go and tell the world that this is a God who will take anyone who would humble themselves before him, because he is able to save even whenever all appears lost. However you need to respond to this message tonight, you can do so now as we stand and as we sing.